Following a minimalist lifestyle is, in my view, a worthwhile aim. After all, what could possibly be wrong with wanting to reduce your consumption, avoiding buying things you don't really need, to help you make room for the things that really matter to you in life? Well, there are quite a few things that can go wrong with minimalism. And in this video, I'm going to explore some of the ways that minimalism can be toxic so that you can be mindful of not falling into these traps. So number one is that minimalism can be competitive. There's certainly nothing wrong with a bit of healthy competition, but when I see people talk about how few items they own, for example, how many items of clothing they own or how many pieces of furniture, I can't help but think that some people are getting into a bit of one-upmanship and missing the point of minimalism. I also think it can cause people to feel like they're not being a good enough minimalist or they're failing at minimalism in some way. Now, this is just my opinion and we're all different, so minimalism will look different to each individual. But in my opinion, minimalism isn't about owning as few items as possible. Minimalism for me is about being more intentional about what I purchase, about the things that I bring into my home. I want to make sure that the things I have, I get joy from them, they have a function and a purpose. And I know what these things are because when I did a major declutter, I was looking at a lot of things that were causing me anxiety because they were sat there and I hadn't used them and I wasn't getting any joy out of them. So certainly those were things that I felt a lot of relief at getting rid of. So I want to be surrounded by the things that when I look at them, I feel a sense of peace because I know I get use out of them. There's not this anxiety about whether I should or shouldn't get rid of them. Number two is when we have rules or gatekeeping about what minimalism is and what it isn't. When I talk about my opinion of minimalism, that is just my opinion. That is just how I choose to use minimalism within my life in a way that works for me and aligns with my values. But I've seen disagreements breaking out in the comment sections claiming that someone isn't a minimalist because they own XYZ. I even saw a comment under a video of a minimalist apartment tour where the person said that the creator wasn't a minimalist because they owned furniture. Maybe there are some people who do think that for them minimalism is about not having any furniture. That's absolutely fine, but it's certainly not the way that I want to adopt minimalism, and I would not be happy without any furniture at all. And this gatekeeping or rule making is certainly not unique to minimalism. We see it in all kinds of communities where people have their opinions about the way something should or shouldn't be done. It's absolutely fine to have an opinion, but remember, everybody is different. Everybody is living under different circumstances. The way that you want to incorporate minimalism may not be the way that someone else does. And it doesn't mean to say that that other person is wrong or that you're right. It's just that we're different. I watch some other minimalist YouTubers who are more extreme in their minimalism and they title their videos as extreme minimalists. And I certainly couldn't be that extreme in my minimalism, but I do learn a lot from what they talk about because it does make me think about whether I do need certain things in my home. And I think it's really important that we listen to other people's perspectives, even if we don't necessarily agree with everything they say. And in fact, we're probably not going to, but that doesn't mean to say we have to get into arguments or start to be insulting or derogatory to people about it. And this may be a controversial thing to say as someone who adopts a minimalist lifestyle, but I don't think there's anything wrong with owning stuff. But I want to make sure that for me and my home, it's the right sort of stuff. And the right sort of stuff for me may not be the right sort of stuff for you, and that's okay. I think often it's less about what you have, but why you have it. And your why for minimalism is important because that's what's going to determine what you bring not only into your home, but into your life. Number three is style over substance. So of course, one aspect of minimalism is the aesthetic, so how a space looks. And often when we think about minimalism, it's pretty much white walls all round, very minimal furniture, not a lot in the space. And admittedly, I do like looking at pictures like that. I think they look very clean and tidy, but it's certainly not an environment that I would want to live in. I think the problem we get into is when people do think that minimalism is like that and only like that, and their space has to look like that, otherwise they're failing in some way. Another thing I was thinking about is that the minimalist aesthetic doesn't mean to say that someone is adopting a minimalist lifestyle. And that's fine because no one is obliged to. But I think it's important that we don't confuse the two. You can design your space to be minimalist and look minimalist, but the actual lifestyle of minimalism, I feel, is an ongoing effort. It's an ongoing commitment to be more intentional about the things that you bring into your home, the things you bring into your life in order to make room for the things that really are important. And for me, that's very different from just decorating a space to be minimal. I do think that if we adopt a minimalist lifestyle where we are more intentional about the things we buy, our homes should look less cluttered anyway, because because we are being more mindful about our purchases. However, our spaces may not conform to the minimalist aesthetic that we see on Instagram. And again, that's okay. And I think we need to be mindful of that, because we may end up thinking that we're doing minimalism wrong, and we may just give up altogether because we think, well, I can't possibly live up to that standard. And while I've been talking about this, have any examples of toxic minimalism come to mind for you? Let me know down in the comments. I'd be interested to hear about it. So number 4 is one that I've become more aware of the more I've watched minimalist videos, and that is whether minimalism is more for rich people or minimalism is classist in some way. So for example, when we talk about decluttering, I think there can be a flippant attitude sometimes in terms of potentially regretting decluttering some items, where people might say, well, if I regret decluttering something, I'll just buy it again. And I think that's great if you can do that, but I think that's a very lucky position to be in. I would class myself as someone like that. You know, if I did get rid of something that I realized I needed again, I could probably easily buy it depending on how much the item was. But clearly there are people who can't afford to do that. If they are decluttering, it has to be a very carefully thought out process. And I think it should be a carefully thought out process anyway, regardless of who we are, because we don't want to get into this cycle of disposing of things and then repurchasing them, because that is a waste of resources. I've also seen other comments by people saying that they are unintentionally minimalist because they don't have many possessions to declutter in the first place. And again, I think it's a valid point that there are a lot of people in life who are living on the bare minimum, and what they have is what they need because they can't afford to have anything that might be classed as a luxury item or something that they want because it brings them joy. They are far more restricted to having things because they absolutely need them. And I don't think it's about blaming people. So if you are someone that is able to afford extra things, that's not your fault. But I think it's about being mindful of how lucky we are to be able to do that. And if anything, it's made me think a lot more carefully about my purchasing. If, for example, something breaks, then thinking about how I can mend it rather than just taking the easy option, which is easier for me because I can afford it, just to buy a replacement. It makes me more mindful about how I spend my money or how I use items, trying to make sure I use them to the end of their life rather than flippantly or without much thought getting rid of them because they're slightly worn. Another aspect is the idea of buying quality items that should, in theory, last you longer rather than buying the cheapest item. I've sort of experienced this both ways, where I have bought cheap items and they've served me really well, but other items I've bought cheaply and they've broken quite quickly, whereas if I'd have spent a bit more money, I probably would have got more use out of them. There are people who cannot afford to buy higher quality items that may last them longer. They are very much restricted to buying the cheaper or cheapest items because of their financial situation. So again, I don't think it's anyone's fault, but I also think we need to be mindful when we're talking about minimalism and how to practice it. There are people who are in a financial position where they may not be able to do those things as compared to people in a different financial situation. And so just because there are people who can afford to buy or rebuy certain things, it doesn't necessarily mean we should. If we can think of ways of reusing so that we're not using more resources, that we're being more mindful about how we use our money and our possessions, then I think that's a good thing. And I think it helps us to keep maybe a bit more humble and more grateful about the situation that we're in when there are other people who might be struggling. Number 5 is that less isn't always more. So most of you have probably heard the phrase less is more, and I've certainly bought into this phrase over the years. I felt that minimalism was about owning as few things as possible, and at certain points in my major declutter that I did of over 10 years worth of stuff, I did think, yeah, I just need to get rid of as much as I can. However, if we follow the philosophy of less is more to the extreme, and this is where I think minimalism can be toxic, the risk is that we declutter and we get rid of things from our home for the sake of doing it. It becomes more about the number of things rather than because it's appropriate for the item to be decluttered or you genuinely want to declutter that item because it's no longer serving you. And this is why I'm a bit hesitant about doing the decluttering challenges that I see on YouTube. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them, but I know what I can be like. I can be very all or nothing. So if I commit to a challenge of decluttering one item on day 1, 2 items on day 2, 3 on day 3, etc., I can become very fixated on that. And if I don't achieve that, I can end up thinking that I failed or I've done it wrong and all sorts of attitudes that aren't very helpful. So perhaps those sort of challenges are not really appropriate for someone like me. Again, maybe that that can get us into a bit of a mindset of just needing to find something to declutter just because you're doing a challenge, rather than it being a genuine need to declutter that. And like I say, this isn't just in the minimalist space. When anything is done to extreme, it can end up not being healthy, or we end up not really doing it for the right reasons. And decluttering is no less immune to this. But in my major declutter, where I decluttered over 10 years worth of stuff, I learned some really valuable lessons through that process. And if you'd like to hear what those are, then click on the video that's on the screen. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.